As the night falls and the darkness creeps in, the world around us changes. Shadows seem to grow longer and the silence becomes deafening. But what happens when the silence is broken by the sound of footsteps that don't belong to anyone you know? What happens when you hear a whisper in your ear but there's no one there? Welcome to our world of horror, where the unknown is the only certainty and fear is the only emotion. Brace yourself, because the journey we're about to take is not for the faint of heart. Alice sat in the lawyer's office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and antique furnishings. She fidgeted nervously in her seat, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had just learned that her grandmother had passed away and had left her something in her will. Alice had always been close to her grandmother, and the news of her passing had hit her hard. She wondered what her grandmother could have left her that was so important. Finally, the lawyer entered the room and introduced himself. He cleared his throat and began reading the will. Alice listened intently, trying to keep her emotions in check. As the lawyer finished reading, he handed Alice an old-fashioned key on a delicate silver chain. "This key is for your grandmother's dollhouse," he said. "She wanted you to have it." Alice's heart skipped a beat. She had forgotten all about the dollhouse. She had loved playing with it as a child, but as she grew older, it had been stored away in the attic. She wondered what condition it was in now. The lawyer gave Alice directions to her grandmother's house and instructed her to take possession of the dollhouse. Alice left the office in a daze, her mind racing with questions. What had her grandmother left her? What condition was the dollhouse in? Why had her grandmother waited until now to give it to her? When Alice arrived at her grandmother's house, she felt a sense of sadness wash over her. The house was still and silent, a stark contrast to the bustling home it had once been. She made her way to the attic and found the dollhouse covered in a thick layer of dust. Alice carefully lifted the dollhouse and carried it down the stairs to the living room. As she set it down on a table, she couldn't help but smile at the memories flooding back to her. She had spent hours playing with the dollhouse, imagining herself as the tiny figures inside. As Alice examined the dollhouse, she noticed that it was in need of repair. The roof was missing shingles, the windows were cracked, and the paint was chipped. She felt a pang of guilt for neglecting it all these years. She decided then and there that she would restore it to its former glory. Alice spent the next few days cleaning the dollhouse and gathering supplies for the restoration. She became obsessed with the project, pouring all of her time and energy into it. As she worked, she felt a sense of purpose she had never felt before. But as the days went on, strange things began to happen in the house. Doors would creak open by themselves, objects would move on their own, and Alice would hear whispers in the night. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, but as the occurrences became more frequent, she began to worry. Despite her fears, Alice was determined to finish the restoration of the dollhouse. She hoped that the project would bring her closer to her grandmother, even in death. Little did she know, the dollhouse held secrets that would put her in grave danger. Alice was fully immersed in the restoration of the dollhouse, spending hours each day sanding, painting, and repairing the intricate details of the tiny rooms. She became so engrossed in the project that she forgot about the strange occurrences that had been happening in the house. Alice had always loved the dollhouse, but she had never realized just how much work went into restoring such an old and delicate piece. She spent hours researching the best techniques and materials to use, and even reached out to a few experts for advice. As she worked, Alice noticed that the dollhouse seemed to have a life of its own. The tiny figures inside the rooms seemed to move on their own, as if they were alive. At first, Alice brushed it off as her imagination, but as the occurrences became more frequent, she couldn't ignore them any longer. One night, as Alice was working late into the evening, she heard a soft whisper coming from the dollhouse. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained her ears, trying to make out what the whisper was saying. It was a child's voice, barely audible, but she could hear it clearly. "Help me," the voice whispered. "Please, help me." Alice was terrified. She didn't know what to do. Was she going crazy? Was the dollhouse haunted? She tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over her and continued working. The next day, Alice decided to take a break from the restoration and explore the town. She hoped that a change of scenery would help clear her mind. She stopped by the local library and began to search through old records and newspaper articles, hoping to find some information about the dollhouse. After several hours of searching, Alice came across an article from the early 1900s. It detailed the tragic story of a wealthy family who had died under mysterious circumstances. The youngest daughter, Emily, had been possessed by a malevolent spirit and had used the dollhouse as a conduit for her evil deeds. The family had perished in a fire, and the dollhouse had been left untouched for decades. Alice was shocked. She couldn't believe what she was reading. Was this the same dollhouse that she was restoring? Was Emily's spirit still trapped inside? Alice hurried back to the house, her heart racing with fear. As she entered the living room, she could feel a chill in the air. The dollhouse seemed to be looming over her, as if it was watching her every move. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Despite her fears, Alice was determined to continue the restoration. She couldn't let Emily's tragic story scare her away. She knew that the dollhouse was special, and that it held a deeper meaning than she could ever imagine. But as she continued to work, she couldn't help but feel that she was being watched, and that the dollhouse was alive in a way that she couldn't understand. Alice was determined to finish the restoration of the dollhouse, despite the strange occurrences and her growing unease. She tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, that the dollhouse was just an old toy with no power over her. But as she continued to work, the feeling of being watched intensified, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. One day, as Alice was painting the walls of one of the dollhouse's rooms, she noticed something odd. The walls were starting to peel, revealing layers of old wallpaper beneath. As she scraped away the layers, she noticed strange symbols etched into the walls beneath. They were old and faded, but Alice could just make out the outlines of pentagrams and other symbols of the occult. Alice's heart raced as she realized the significance of what she had found. This was no ordinary dollhouse. It was a vessel for something far more sinister. She knew that she had to investigate further. Alice delved deeper into the history of the dollhouse, scouring old records and talking to local historians. She discovered that the original owner, a wealthy merchant, had dabbled in the occult and had used the dollhouse as a tool for his dark practices. He had summoned dark entities and had even sacrificed small animals to appease them. As Alice pieced together the history of the dollhouse, she became more and more convinced that the spirit of Emily, the possessed daughter, was still trapped inside. She had to find a way to free her, to put her spirit to rest once and for all. Alice decided to perform a ritual to cleanse the dollhouse of its dark energy. She spent hours researching the correct incantations and gathering the necessary materials. She lit candles and placed them around the dollhouse, then began to chant the incantation. As she chanted, she felt a cold breeze sweep through the room. The flames of the candles flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Alice's heart raced as she felt a presence in the room, something dark and powerful. Suddenly, the dollhouse began to shake violently. The tiny figures inside the room started to move on their own, their painted faces contorting into twisted expressions. Alice tried to stop the ritual, but it was too late. The dollhouse had been awakened, and there was no turning back. Alice watched in horror as the dollhouse's walls began to crack, revealing dark and twisted corridors beneath. She could hear screams and whispers coming from within. She tried to run, but she was trapped. The dollhouse had become a portal to another realm, a realm of darkness and despair. As Alice's vision began to blur and fade, she heard Emily's voice one last time. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have freed me." And with that, the dollhouse collapsed in on itself, leaving Alice alone in the darkness. She knew that she had survived something truly terrifying, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the dollhouse's dark energy still lingered within her. After the terrifying events of the ritual, Alice was left shaken and traumatized. She had nightmares every night, haunted by the images of the possessed dollhouse and the dark entities she had unleashed. In her dreams, she saw the tiny figures inside the dollhouse come to life, their painted faces contorting into twisted expressions as they moved on their own. She heard screams and whispers, and felt a cold breeze sweeping through the room. Alice tried to shake off the dreams and focus on her daily routine, but she couldn't escape the feeling that something was following her, watching her every move. She started to see glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, but every time she turned to look, there was nothing there. One night, Alice woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing. She had dreamed that she was back in the dollhouse, but this time she was the one trapped inside. She could feel the dark energy surrounding her, suffocating her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. As Alice tried to catch her breath, she heard a soft whisper in her ear. "You freed me," the voice said. "Now I am with you forever." Alice screamed and scrambled out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned on all the lights in her apartment, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Alice knew that she couldn't go on like this. She needed to find a way to banish the dark energy that was following her, before it consumed her completely. She reached out to a local psychic, who agreed to come to her apartment and perform a cleansing ritual. The psychic brought with her a bundle of sage and other materials, and began to chant as she moved from room to room. As the psychic chanted, Alice could feel the heavy weight of the dark energy lifting from her apartment. The feeling of being watched disappeared, and she could breathe easier. After the cleansing ritual, Alice felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She no longer had nightmares, and the feeling of being watched had disappeared. She felt like she could finally move on from the terror that the dollhouse had inflicted on her. But as she packed up the dollhouse to put it away in storage, she noticed something odd. The figures inside the dollhouse had changed. They were no longer twisted and contorted, but were now frozen in expressions of peace and tranquility. Alice felt a shiver run down her spine as she realized the implications of what she had seen. The dollhouse had been freed from the dark energy that had possessed it, but at what cost? She knew that she could never forget the terror she had experienced, and that the dollhouse would forever be a reminder of the dangers of playing with the occult. Months passed, and Alice tried her best to move on from the terrifying events that had taken place in her apartment. She had put the dollhouse away in storage, and had even considered getting rid of it altogether. But something inside her kept telling her to hold on to it, as a reminder of what she had gone through. One evening, as Alice was getting ready for bed, she heard a faint tapping sound coming from the storage room where the dollhouse was kept. She dismissed it as her imagination, but the sound persisted. Curiosity getting the better of her, Alice cautiously opened the door to the storage room. To her surprise, the dollhouse was sitting on a table in the center of the room, with its tiny figures arranged in a way that she had never seen before. As she approached the dollhouse, Alice could feel a strange energy emanating from it. It was the same dark energy that she had felt before, but it was stronger now, more intense. Suddenly, Alice heard a voice coming from inside the dollhouse. It was a child's voice, faint and distant, but unmistakably human. "Help me," the voice said. "I'm trapped." Alice recoiled in horror as she realized what was happening. The dollhouse was once again possessed by the dark energy, and this time it was using the tiny figures inside it to communicate with her. She knew that she had to act fast, before the dark energy consumed her once again. She reached out to the psychic who had helped her before, and explained the situation to her. The psychic agreed to come to Alice's apartment the next day, and perform another cleansing ritual. The next day, the psychic arrived at Alice's apartment and immediately set to work. She went into the storage room where the dollhouse was kept, and began to chant as she moved her hands over the dollhouse. As the psychic chanted, Alice could feel the dark energy lifting from the dollhouse, and the tapping sound that had been plaguing her apartment faded away. She knew that the psychic had banished the dark energy once again, and that the dollhouse was now safe. But as the psychic left her apartment, Alice couldn't shake off the feeling that something was not quite right. She had a nagging suspicion that the dark energy was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike again. As the days went by, Alice became increasingly paranoid. She would hear faint whispers in her ear, and see movement out of the corner of her eye. She knew that the dark energy was still with her, and that it was only a matter of time before it revealed itself once again. One night, as Alice was lying in bed, she felt a cold breeze sweep through the room. She turned on the lights, but there was nobody there. As she looked around the room, she noticed something odd. The tiny figures from the dollhouse were arranged on her nightstand, in the same formation that she had seen them in the storage room. Alice screamed and ran out of her apartment, knowing that she could no longer stay there. She knew that the dark energy had returned, and that it was more powerful than ever. As she looked back at her apartment from a safe distance, Alice knew that she would never be able to forget the terror that the dollhouse had brought into her life. She knew that the dark energy was still out there, waiting to claim its next victim, and that she had been lucky to escape with her life. Alice spent the next few days trying to figure out what to do. She knew that she couldn't stay in her apartment anymore, but she also didn't want to leave the dollhouse behind. She had a feeling that if she abandoned it, the dark energy would continue to terrorize other people. In the end, Alice decided to take matters into her own hands. She would confront the dark energy head-on and try to banish it once and for all. Alice reached out to the psychic who had helped her before, and together they formulated a plan. They would perform a powerful ritual, using crystals and incense to amplify their energy and drive the dark energy away. On the night of the ritual, Alice set up the dollhouse in the center of her living room. She surrounded it with crystals and lit incense in every corner of the room. She and the psychic sat cross-legged on the floor, facing the dollhouse. As they began to chant, Alice could feel the dark energy growing stronger. It was as if it knew what they were trying to do, and was resisting their efforts. The chanting grew louder and more intense, and Alice and the psychic began to sway back and forth. The room grew hot and stuffy, and Alice felt as though she was suffocating. Suddenly, the dollhouse began to shake violently. The tiny figures inside it started to move on their own, and Alice could hear them whispering incoherently. The psychic urged Alice to keep chanting, but Alice was overcome with fear. She felt as though the dark energy was about to consume her, and that she would never be able to escape. But then, something miraculous happened. The crystals around the dollhouse began to glow, and a bright light filled the room. The incense smoke swirled around the room, and the chanting grew louder and more powerful. Alice felt a surge of energy coursing through her body, and she knew that they were winning the battle against the dark energy. As the light faded, Alice saw that the dollhouse was now peaceful and quiet. The tiny figures inside it were still, and the dark energy was nowhere to be found. Alice and the psychic hugged each other in relief. They had done it. They had banished the dark energy once and for all. Alice knew that she would never be able to forget the horror that she had experienced, but she also knew that she had triumphed over it. She had confronted her fears head-on, and had come out the other side stronger and more resilient. As she packed up the dollhouse and prepared to leave her apartment for good, Alice felt a sense of closure. She knew that the dollhouse would always hold a special place in her heart, but she was also ready to move on. As she left her apartment for the last time, Alice knew that the dark energy was no longer a threat. She had conquered it, and she was finally free.